Hey, that's a great question. Why do I still read the Bible if I'm an atheist? First up, I didn't for many years. I became an atheist. Well, I didn't call myself an atheist yet at 23, but I left the faith at 23. It took me a couple of years to realize that atheist doesn't mean I know there's no God. It just means I believe there's no God. So I'm an agnostic atheist. Pretty sure the Christian God doesn't exist, because if he does, he's a monster. I won't go into that right now, but why do I read the Bible? Well, I didn't for a good more than 20 years probably, but I started getting interested in it again, mostly because I studied psychology, and I started getting interested in how people fall into cults and how people believe religion in general, supernatural stuff that we can't see. And so I don't know what I started with, but it could be misquoting Jesus, a podcast by a man named... Actually, I think I probably started with some deconstruction stuff. But anyway, there's a podcast by Bart Ehrman, who is a biblical scholar, called Misquoting Jesus. He's a biblical scholar who started out as an evangelical. As he studied the Bible to become a biblical scholar at an evangelical college, he realized that the ideas that come from evangelicalism, that the Bible is inerrant and has no contradictions, can't be true, because there's lots of contradictions and lots of errors. And that did not mean he wasn't a Christian. It did for me. If you look back at that previous video, being an evangelical, I'm sort of an in or out kind of guy. And so, having been evangelical and believing that the Bible was inerrant, when I started seeing the errors and the contradictions, I just lost the faith in the whole thing. But a couple of decades later, after having listened to some deconstruction stuff, might have started actually with a podcast called... I have ADHD, by the way, so my brain is going all over the place. Might have started with a podcast called I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, which is a podcast of two men who had been training to be pastors many years ago in the Assemblies of God Church in Australia, and it's about how they ended up losing their faith. So I started listening to that podcast. Anyway, ended up, I think they might have had Bart Ehrman on, or they talked about Bart Ehrman. Yeah, they're pretty sure they had Bart Ehrman on. Became very interested in that. Started listening to his podcast, read his book, he's written lots of books, but he also has a book called Misquoting Jesus. And I started to get fascinated in the Bible again. And then, your question is, why do I read the Bible when I'm not a Christian? Well, first of all, I'm reading the Old Testament, which is Jewish. I'm also not Jewish. But second of all, I mean, we all read Aesop's fables. None of us believe those are true. We read lots of fiction. So it's interesting, even if it's not true, or even if much of it is not true. It also, as I'm looking at it now as an outsider, not believing that it's the Word of God, that it's inerrant and has no contradictions, all that sort of stuff. I'm looking at it as literature, and it's interesting. It takes place, it was written over the course of around 1,000 years, maybe a bit more. And so lots of different time periods, people in different contexts, and it reads as a way of understanding how over those centuries, these people in this particular area, or particular people in this particular area, were figuring out what's happening in the universe. What's happening, well, they didn't know about the universe, but what's happening in the world. And, they disagree with each other. There are books like Ecclesiastes that say everything is meaningless. And then there's other books where there's, obviously most of the Bible, everything's filled with meaning. So it's interesting to see how these different people were working out what's happening over time. In fact, I think religion was the precursor to science. Religion was asking questions, religion and mythology and philosophy, but they're all asking questions to work out why things are the way that they are. Now, science has moved on to observable and testable facts. But I would say the most major reason that I'm doing this whole reading the Bible thing right now, especially doing the whole thing of reading the Bible on TikTok publicly, is that the world right now, and maybe always, but right now we got this war between America and Iran, and a lot of that has to do with religion. A lot of that has to do, I don't think Donald Trump himself is a believer, but he is doing the bidding of evangelical Christians who believe that certain things have to happen in the Middle East for the rapture to happen, for Jesus to come back. So they're actually rooting for all of this war and destruction. Also, there's a lot of Christians who fight against Muslims, which is so weird, because they're worshiping the same God. Even weirder is, for example, the wars between Sunni and Shiite. Sorry, not that well versed in Islam, but wars between different sects of Islam, and then also the wars over the centuries in Ireland between Protestants and Catholics. They're in the same religion, but they've got these tiny disagreements that cause war. So the Bible and the Quran, between the Bible and the Quran, over half of the human population believe in these things. Over half of the human population believe in the God of Abraham. So, despite the fact that I don't believe, it's very important to understand what the majority of humans do believe. And I also, by reading and just sharing my thoughts as I read, I have a hope that those Christians who are deconstructing or who are near the point of beginning to deconstruct can see that they're not alone, and can see where these contradictions lie, and these things that just don't make sense, and these things that mean this version of God. As I say, I'm agnostic. I haven't seen any evidence of God, so I'm an atheist because I don't happen to believe in any gods, but I don't claim to know. However, this particular God, I think it's very unlikely that he exists, and if he does, he's a monster. And exposing that by just reading the text that these people purport to believe in, that I used to purport to believe in, I think is important. And especially because much of the Bible is never read by most Christians. They go to church and they hear the parts that the preachers choose to share because they're the so-called good parts, although plenty of the parts that they choose to share are bad, like being queer-phobic. But I think it's important that all of us have some knowledge of what's in that book.